Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Patrick Diamond, and I'm the director of the Mile End Institute at Queen Mary, University of London. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event this afternoon on UK competition policy. I'm going to hand straight over to our chair, but I just want to say, by way of introduction, that the Mile End Institute is a research institute based at Queen Mary, which examines a multitude of issues in public policy, politics, and public life. This is the first event that we've ever hosted that looks at competition policy. So we're particularly delighted to have you with us here this afternoon. If you'd like to know more about the events and publications that we produce, then do feel free to sign up to our mailing list, which you can access via the Mile End Institute website. We host a range of events across the year, and it would be great to have as many of you as possible participate in those, so do please sign up. Other than that, I just want to welcome you and say that I'm very much looking forward to this afternoon's event, and I'm going to hand over to our chair, David, who's brought this event together. I want to thank him, and also obviously our panel who've given up their time to be with us. So David, thanks so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. And just to avoid confusion, we will have two Davids here as well. But let's actually jump in. So hello and welcome to the Mile End Institute at Queen Mary University. My name is David Pakozdi. I am a teaching assistant and journalist. And today we are focusing on how the UK's competition policy can tackle the power of the dominant tech platforms, how this toolkit can evolve, given the increased role of the Competition and Markets Authority, or the CMA, as a result of Brexit, and whether we should be more worried about the rise of algorithms. This event takes place amid critical discussions around the power of large tech firms in economics and politics. The digital markets which are intermediated by these companies, such as advertising, social media, e-commerce, and smartphones, are all very different, but they are subject to some common forces. Network effects make them more valuable to users whenever new users join them. Economies of scale reduce costs as firms expand, and data also became a crucial competitive advantage for them. This mix can make markets to tip in favor of a handful of dominant firms, something that we might have seen again in advertising, social media, e-commerce, and smartphones. While these economic characteristics have become apparent through expert studies, such as from the UK's Digital Competition Expert Panel, competition policy also entered the political arena. Senator Elizabeth Warren campaigned to become the Democratic presidential nominee on the back of her pledge to break up the big tech firms, and a congressional report last year recommended tough action against the digital giants, including possible breakups as well. The appeal of this tough approach looks enduring, as the report's chief architect Lina Khan appeared before a Senate hearing just last week on her way to become one of the top competition regulators in the US. At the same time, the US has multiple lawsuits against Facebook and Google, while the EU and the UK are investigating potential anti-competitive moves by Apple and Amazon. Regulators also update their toolkits to tackle such monopolistic moves. For example, last year, the EU introduced its Digital Markets Act that imposes specific obligations on dominant firms who fall above a certain threshold. Expert reports generally agree with the DMA's approach to regulate platforms ex ante, because the fast-paced digital world means that harms to competition are difficult to address after they already happen. But many think that the DMA is neither specific nor flexible enough to accommodate the different types of business models and the abuses of dominance by the tech platforms. The CMA's new Digital Markets Unit was praised because it could overcome these issues. It is meant to designate the most powerful tech businesses as having strategic market status, to impose a specific code of conduct on them, investigate their acquisitions more closely, and apply so-called pro-competitive interventions, such as interoperability requirements. The CMA's flexible approach also seems better at avoiding so-called regulatory cliff edges when a firm that falls above a quantitative threshold faces stricter rules compared to similar firms just below that level. On the other hand, some worry that this flexibility could mean that the CMA needs to compromise on speed and regulatory certainty, but we will explore these issues shortly. COVID-19 also impacted competition. According to Professor Nancy Rose at MIT, the pandemic could not only supercharge the power of the major tech platforms, but it could also reduce financing for smaller, innovative firms that are often important for productivity growth. the economic downturn could also mean that cash-rich acquirers could invoke what we call the failing firm defense and basically argue that they should be allowed to buy the target company because otherwise no one would and it would go bankrupt. And lastly, there are worries that algorithms could hurt competition even with limited or no human involvement. Spotify, for example, could tilt the playing field against independent musicians by recommending songs from major labels on its playlists. Google could distort competition in advertising by directing business from its dominant ad buying tool to its also dominant ad exchange. And lastly, pricing algorithms could also collude, at least in theory, to raise prices for consumers. So to help us understand these issues, we are joined today by a panel that brings together enormous expertise in all things competition policy and especially digital platforms, as they have experience in leading roles in government, the private sector, and academia. So I will now introduce the panel, after which each of them will make some introductory remarks, which I will follow up with some brief questions. Then we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you want to ask a pressing query from the experts, please use the chat box or the Q&A function that we will monitor throughout the event. And you can also raise questions through the MEI competition policy hashtag on Twitter. So it's MEI competition policy. Now to the panelists. Amelia Fletcher is a professor of competition policy at Norwich Business School and the deputy director at the Center for Competition Policy at the University of East Anglia. She is also a non-executive director of the CMA, and she was recently a member of the Digital Competition Expert Panel, which reported in March 2019. She has been a non-executive director of the Financial Conduct Authority and the Payment System Regulator, and the chief economist at the Office for Fair Trading. Mike Walker is chief economic advisor at the CMA. He's also an academic at King's College London and the College of Europe in Bruges, and the co-author of the Economics of the EU Competition Law. Mike previously served as the Director of Competition Policy at London Economics, Senior Regulatory Economist with British Telecom, and Senior Associate and Vice President, respectively, at Lexicon and Charles River Associates. And lastly, David Parker is a Director in Competition Practice at Frontier Economics. He has worked at Frontier since 1999, advising firms facing competition investigations in relation to various issues, including mergers, agreements, abuses of dominance, and sectoral inquiries, both in the EU and UK. David has extensive expertise in digital markets, where his clients include Facebook, Just Eat, Zoopla, and the Daily Mail Group, and Experian. So now, before we can move to the questions, I will now pass this on to the panelists to have their opening remarks. Maybe we can start with you, Amelia, followed by Mike and David, if that's okay. And in between you can just pass the virtual mic to each other.
Okay, very good. I'm going to put up a slide if it works. Let's see. Okay, so hopefully I've got a slide up there. I should say that I'm probably going to repeat a little bit of what David said, but he asked me to say a little bit about competition concerns in digital platform markets, particularly the big tech digital platforms, and where we've got to in terms of thinking about what to do about them. So this slide really draws on my work with the Digital Competition Expert Panel, sometimes known as the FIRMM panel, which reported in March 2019 now, I mean, some time ago now. At the time, the report was quite novel in that it highlighted the concerns in these markets very, very clearly, but also said that they didn't feel that antitrust was going to be sufficient to deal with them and that we needed regulation. So what did it find? We found that some digital platform markets had become very highly concentrated, more or less globally, and in particular in the UK. We found that some of these platforms were exhibiting essentially gatekeeper positions or bottleneck positions vis-a-vis some users. So some users were really needing to use these platforms to gain access to users on the other side. In particular, often business users really needed to use these platforms in order to gain access to consumers. And that conferred a degree of kind of bottleneck market power. And that we also were concerned that these market positions were becoming extended into new services, creating kind of whole digital ecosystems. And that isn't necessarily a problem, but it's a problem if it leads to markets that are not contestable or not as easily contestable by others. The factors we thought were really driving that, both within markets and in terms of extension across markets, have been mentioned by David, but strong trans-global economies of scale and scope. Clearly that's not novel to digital, but it's particularly significant in digital. The role of big data and the role it plays in machine learning algorithms. So big data is essentially an output of some of the services and some of the platforms, but it's also a really key input. So it feeds into the machine learning algorithms and helps create better services for people, better targeted advertising, etc. So it's a very key aspect of input into competing in these markets. We identified network effects, as David mentioned. We also particularly looked at the lack of multi-homing. So this occurs when there may be two platforms available, but actually users on at least one side of the market only utilize one platform, or only usually utilize one platform. And we also looked in a lot of detail at interoperability and where there was interoperability and where there wasn't interoperability, and the competition concerns around that. We also, and probably quite novel in our report, really focused on consumer behaviour and biases, things like customer inertia and the ability to influence quite strongly consumer behaviour by the interface design or choice architecture you put in front of them. And then we also highlighted strategic conduct. We know that, that all of the first four bullets here are kind of intrinsic, they're inherent to the economics of these platform markets. The final one is where they start actually behaving anti-competitively. And we know that that occurs too, because we've had European cases decided on those matters. But the key thing we found is that antitrust can really only decide to deal with the last of those bullets. It's not actually that good at dealing with the inherent economic drivers of concentration and extension across markets in these markets. And even where it is about strategic conduct, antitrust is slow, relatively narrow, relatively backwards looking, and we felt that it therefore wasn't suitable for addressing the problems we were seeing in the kind of holistic market framing way that was needed. So we recommended that there needed to be ex-ante regulation, as David said. And what's interesting is we were thinking about the UK, and we've made recommendations to the UK. At the time, the EU didn't seem very interested. Now the EU has somewhat leapfrogged in a way, the UK, and that it actually has legislation, draft legislation on the table. In the UK, the government has shown a lot of commitment towards this legislation and set up a digital markets task force to provide advice on implementation. And it has also now set up a shadow version of the proposed regulator, the Digital Markets Unit, within the CMA. So there's a lot of commitment there, but there isn't actually draft legislation on the table like there is in the EU. What's interesting is both the UK and the EU legislation, they have upfront high-level objectives. Then they are both designed to designate specific firms. So this isn't regulation that covers all digital platforms. It is very much targeted at an unspecified number, but relatively few, very large digital platform firms active, and the EU and the UK differ. Maybe we could talk a little bit more later about how they differ, but they differ a little bit in how they are setting up these designation criteria. Then in the UK, there would be codes of conduct for those designated firms, and those are designed to be bespoke and developed alongside the designation process. So we don't know what those would look like yet. In the EU, by contrast, within the legislation, there are 18 obligations kind of pre-specified, some of which are absolute in that firms are just expected to abide by them, some of which the firms can come back to the commission and say, okay, we don't really know how to apply this to our firm, we need further specification. There's a difference in terms of the bespoke nature and the preordained nature of the regulation. And then in the UK, there are also the ability to do pro-competitive interventions where you can say, okay, we would think something like a specific piece of interoperability or a specific piece of data sharing or a specific piece of data portability would be really useful for opening up competition. And so that can be done after a market review. That isn't possible in the EU. They haven't allowed for that, although they do have rather overarching obligations around data sharing and data portability and interoperability. So they've approached to some extent the same issues, but in a very different way. So I've really not got much time, so I'll probably leave it there, but hopefully there's enough there to get into questions later. Thank you.
Okay, so I think it's my turn now. So I'm going to talk about what I think we've learned about digital platforms over the last few years in the UK and the EU, and therefore what that implies and why we need some of the regulation that Amelia's been talking about. I think the first thing to say, though, whenever we talk about digital platforms, is we do, as our starting point, need to recognise the fact that they produce great products. We know, well, I mean, there's research suggesting that the average American consumer would need to be compensated about $17,000 to give up Google search for a year. We know that Amazon is super convenient and has been fantastic for millions of small suppliers around the world who suddenly had their addressable market dramatically increased. We know that Apple's products are deeply beautiful and lovely. Apparently, people like Facebook are more than 40 million active users per month in the UK alone. So these products are great. And so when people say, you've got to be really careful not to regulate and so damage the ability for these firms to continue producing great products, that's a really important point. But it's not a get out jail free card. It doesn't mean that competition policy doesn't apply to these firms just because they produce such lovely products. Okay, so what do I think we've learned in Europe over the last few years? Okay, I think we've learned 5 or 6 things. One, I think we've learned the competition policy has failed, and I will explain why I think that. Secondly, I think what we've learned is that unilateral conduct provisions of competition policy, so Article 102 in the EU or Chapter 2 in the UK or monopolisation in the US, have definitely failed. Why is that? The case is just too slow. It just takes forever. So, for instance, if we think about the European Commission's case against Google Shopping, one of their cases, that started in November 2010, decision in June 2017, it's now an appeal. Think about Google Android case, opened in 2015 in response to 2013 complaint. Decision 2018, that's now on appeal. And that's a case which, this is a biased sample, but every year my students always talk about the Google Android case as being the obvious case of abusive dominance, and all the other cases we're going to have a discussion about. And yet, even that, it's 8 years since the original complaint and not finished. Google AdSense 2019 decision relating to behaviour going back to 2006. These cases just take too long, and they just deal with the specific issue. In that case, they don't deal with the fundamental issue of firms exercising market power. And large, sophisticated firms will find ways to exercise market power. If one way is blocked, they'll find another way. So you just end up playing whack-a-mole. So I think we know unilateral conduct provisions don't work. I think we also know that the firm's ability to their development strategies, their ability to create these ecosystems is also not something that competition policy can deal with, because actually there's lots of aspects of those ecosystems that are really efficient and great for consumers. There's also the fact, however, that it makes entry very hard for other players, and also I think we've seen behavior by these platforms to ensure that entry is hard for other players, and that's a problem in the long run for competition policy. What else? I think we learned that merger control matters in this area and that it has under-enforced. So why do I say that? Well, if I think about Google's position in the ad tech market, so that's the set of markets between the advertiser who wants to advertise and the publisher, the website owner who has a website who's willing to accept adverts, that is a market which is the ad tech market, the vertical chain between them, basically controlled by Google. They've got more than 50% in every segment, more than 90% in some segments. The CMA found that they had market power, found that that had adverse effects on competition, ultimately consumers, and that can be traced back to the 2008 DoubleClick merger when Google was allowed to buy DoubleClick. And then there's other things, Google buying, Facebook buying WhatsApp, Facebook buying Instagram. Merger control has not been able to deal with these issues in the past, so I think we've learned that merger control, not just in approach and attitude, but also in terms of its powers, needs to be strengthened. What else have we learned? I think we've learned that the market power of these platforms is genuinely entrenched. So I think now even Facebook's a bit embarrassed when it has to say, oh, well, look at MySpace and how, you can easily get replaced, more than 15 years ago, or Google are having to refer back to Yahoo. So I think we know the market power of these firms is entrenched. Google's had more than 90% of the search market in the UK for more than 10 years. Facebook or Instagram and WhatsApp has been in very strong position again for more than a decade. And whilst, when someone says to me, but look, they could just be replaced overnight by some great new innovation. Well, maybe, but they probably won't be. And as a competition authority, I have to care about the probabilities. So I think we know that those market positions look very entrenched, and therefore we should worry about that. And I think we also know that privacy regulation and competition policy need to work together, and that they shouldn't, and that regulations deal with privacy can have implications for competition policy, and equally competition policy can have implications for privacy regulators' ability to do their job, and it's very important that these regulators act together. So what does that imply? Well, I think that implies we do need some regulation. Amelia mentioned and David, the DMU. I think the aim of that regulation has to be twofold. One, it should be concerned with ensuring the platforms can't exercise their current market power. Absolutely, that's very important. Two, more important, is that regulation should be aimed at ensuring that new firms can come into the market and can be successful and can compete against platforms, and yes, can replace those platforms over time, or at least become very substantive competitors, and they don't run the risk of either being squashed by one of the platforms, Facebook squashing Vine, for instance, or bought by one of the platforms, so Facebook buying Instagram or whatever. Sorry, Dave, for keep going on about Facebook, since I know, as you said, one of your clients. But we do really need to focus on incentivizing and allowing innovation to happen, and for firms to do that and to compete on a level playing field against these platforms, so that in the long run we get competition. Okay, since I'm just running out of time, two final sort of thoughts really. So one is that I often hear the argument when I'm doing events like this or so on, hear the argument that the future of these markets is very uncertain. They're fast-moving digital markets, don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, that there's a high danger of regulatory mistakes, and that therefore regulators should leave them alone. Don't intervene, you don't know what you're doing. Okay, look, I think this argument is profoundly wrong, and here's why. It suggests that the only danger here is a danger of over-intervention, but that's not true. There are very substantial risks to inaction, as I think we've seen through past regulatory inaction, such as markets tipping or incumbents being able to drive innovative firms out of the market. This idea that inaction, just letting the market play out, is a neutral choice is just wrong. It's not a neutral choice. It is an active choice, okay? And we can have an argument as to whether it's the right choice, but we can't just say, oh, it's all too difficult, we'll do the easy thing, we'll do nothing. It's not the easy thing, and it's probably wrong. Then the final comment is, we're talking about this as in terms of the UK, we mentioned the DMA in Europe. These digital platforms, they're global players. Okay, and so I think it's really important that we have regulatory consistency between the US and us and Europe and other jurisdictions, Japan, Australia, China, whatever. It's not just important for consumers, because if we have regulatory inconsistency, we will find that some platforms or some firms will just stop supplying some products in some markets, which will be bad for consumers. But it's also really important for the firms. They need to have a set of rules that they know what those rules are, and then they can operate on the basis of those rules. So it's really important that we have international cooperation and that all the various regulatory authorities around the world talk to each other as they are at the moment, but that's a really important thing. And that's my 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you for mentioning some of my clients. Always very helpful. I should start, of course, by saying that the views you're going to hear are my own views and not those of any of my clients. I'm sure that goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I'll pick up on a couple of the points that Mike raised from more of a private sector perspective. I think first is the decade ahead, probably at least, is going to be challenging for digital firms because of the fragmentation in approaches. As Mike has identified, if you're a global firm operating in global markets, you'd ideally want to have a global approach to compliance so you can do the same thing everywhere. Historically, what this has meant is that where there's been an advance in regulation in, say, a particularly important jurisdiction, that can become a global standard, because if it applies to a global firm, they will try and implement it everywhere. So the GDPR at EU level has had wider impacts across the globe because it got out ahead of everyone else. Firms have responded by essentially complying with GDPR on a much broader basis. I think what's going to be difficult here, and so I very much echo Mike's the point that Mike made at the end, which is we've got multiple developments happening simultaneously in different jurisdictions. I think that is going to make life very difficult across the board. I think I'm in probably a different place from Amelia in terms of I see the UK approach and the EU approach as being really very different in the way that they are going to be implemented. One is a set of rules that apply to everyone. Everyone knows where they stand. They may or may not be tailored to your particular circumstances or appropriate for your circumstances, but you know what they are. Whereas the UK approach will be much more bespoke. It will be targeted at individual firms. I think that's going to create a level of divergence that firms are going to find it difficult to comply with across the board. And that's just two jurisdictions. The ACCC is very active in Australia. The US is definitely going to be involved in this debate as well. I think one could see quite a bit of regulatory divergence happening before eventually, I suspect, there will be some convergence later on. And then second, and this is not to say that there should be no regulation in the digital sector at all. That would be, I think, not the right position at all. But inevitably, we need to look at the law of unintended consequences. Mike raised some of these already, which is, for one example, is that firms might reduce their product innovation or doing things differently in particular jurisdictions where they might fall foul of the regulation in those particular areas. So let's just take one example, which is something that Amelia raised at the beginning: ecosystems. There's a concern that's been raised about firms with ecosystems. Ecosystems generally relate to firms that operate multiple products, possibly with a kind of single point of entry. So I will steer away from my clients and think of a Google example. So my daughter's school uses Google Classroom. You can get to Google Classroom through Google Chrome, through the browser. So that's part of the Google ecosystem. Is this a problem? Well, I'm not so sure. Does it make it more difficult to enter into the browser market because of there now being a classroom product? Well, that doesn't seem obvious. Do you need to now operate both a browser and a classroom product. That doesn't seem obvious to me either. So I think we need to think quite hard about the rules that we put in place in relation to innovation by all firms, because there's a lot of ecosystem on ecosystem competition. Let's take a bigger example. Currently, the phone operating system competition takes place between Google and Android. It's ecosystem on ecosystem. If the second firm, if one firm had been prevented from doing that because of concerns about ecosystems, I'm not sure that that would have increased competition. And this really matters. And the reason it matters is because under the proposed DMU, for example, if you get this wrong as a digital firm that's got SMS, the fines are potentially in the order of billions. So at that point, I might be thinking, well, maybe I just don't take the risk. And I'm not saying that this means we should have a zero regulation approach, but we do need to be careful, and we need to think quite hard about when we might end up with these unintended consequences and try and minimize those. So I think I'll leave it there, because I'm sure people have got masses of questions, so I'll leave plenty of space. Thank you.
Great, thanks everyone. I think this was very good, and you did touch upon quite a lot of interesting things which I would have wanted to ask you, so we can move on from them. But nevertheless, there are, I think, very important questions to discuss. So now I will ask some of these questions. I try to aim it again at a certain panelist, but I mean, you should feel free to interact, to jump in and potentially disagree as well if you want to. So I think a lot of you mentioned the danger of regulatory consistency and fragmentation, possibly. David, you talked about the dangers of fragmentation. And as we all know, Brexit is going to leave the UK more isolated, generally speaking, but the CMA looks more like an exception than the rule. In March, there was this international working group set up with enforcement agencies from the US, from Canada and the EU to look more closely into pharmaceutical mergers, especially. I was wondering, maybe a question for you Mike, first. What are the concerns of the CMA, specifically in pharmaceuticals? We heard Rebecca Kelly-Slaughter from the US referring to, for example, killer acquisitions in the pharmaceutical sector. So why should we be worried about them?
Okay, so a couple of I think questions in that. So look, I mean, this Pharma Working Party, I mean, that's very much sort of driven by Rebecca Slaughter, as you mentioned, and by US experience, and she is concerned about under-enforcement of pharma mergers, and she said that publicly, and I think in particular worried that a narrow focus on particular product markets has led to merger control authorities missing the bigger picture. Now, we historically haven't done very many pharma mergers because they're big mergers. They've gone to European Commission. Obviously, now, to the extent that pharma mergers affect the UK market, we will have to deal with them. So I think we are part of that working party, but I think it'd be presumptuous of us to say that we're anything other than largely along to learn and to help with the research. I don't think we have any big lessons to offer at this moment. Okay, killer acquisitions. So, I mean, there's this well-known paper by Cunningham et al. On killer acquisitions in the pharma market. And yeah, what's the idea? The basic idea there is that a branded manufacturer has an incentive to buy generic companies who are likely to introduce a generic competitor to their branded good, and then basically just to stop that generic company's activity, so their entry. So that's a killer acquisition, and Cunningham et al. They provide some evidence that has happened in pharma markets. Of course, that's very much branded on generic, which is only a subset of concerns in pharma markets. But given that evidence, it is a reasonable concern to have, reasonable therefore to do more work on that. Of course, killer acquisitions is now talked about in a wider context than just in the context of pharma. So people sometimes talk about kill acquisitions or reverse kill acquisitions. Some people talk about Instagram as being sort of a killer acquisition in the sense that it killed the potential competition for Instagram. Obviously didn't kill the product, whereas the Cunningham et al. Pharma type stuff is all about killing the product. There's also this idea of reverse kill acquisitions, so where an incumbent firm might buy another firm and as a result stop its own research because the firm, the potential entrant firm, whatever it's buying, is doing that research. Give you an example of that in the UK and the US. PacBio wanted to buy Illumina. Those are two firms that are active in genome sequencing. And without going into details, there was a very coherent theory of harm that absent the merger, PacBio was going to have to innovate in a particular way to compete with Illumina. Illumina is going to have to innovate to compete with PacBio in the future, but with the merger, Illumina will be able to stop its innovation things just by PacBio, and so you would lose an innovation force in the market. Okay, so that might be called a reverse kill acquisition. Illumina being the big company there, buying a smaller company, and then stopping its own research was the theory of harm.
Can I jump in and just say one point on the killer acquisitions debate? Because it has started in pharma, as Mike says, and it's moved across to digital markets. I'm not sure that the transfer has been particularly happy. And the reason for that is the nature of the innovation that I think is going on in pharma markets versus digital markets. So the way I think about innovation in pharma markets is a bit like trains. So you start at somewhere, you've got a set of tracks, and you hope you get to your destination. And it's pretty clear what that destination is because that's where the tracks go. So if you're making, if you're doing R&D into a molecule that is designed to have a particular effect on the body, chances are you'll end up with a product that has that kind of effect. I'm saying absolutely this is the case, but mostly this is the case. In 10 years' time, due to the number of regulatory hurdles you need to run through and the testing that you need to do, if you're on a particular pathway 10 years ago, the aim is that you end up where you are today, and that's the direction of travel. It's pretty clear. Digital markets, I think it's much less clear that someone with a particular product today will end up in a particular place in 10 years' time. And so the idea that potentially two firms, let's say they're currently doing very different things, but they might come together in the future. Well, they might. That's very possible. They could go completely the other way. There might be loads of other firms that we haven't yet thought of that are probably outside your screen of view that are now coming in and in 10 years' time will produce that product to compete with the original firm. I think I view innovation in digital markets as much more ships rather than trains. Ship can leave the harbour, it can go anywhere. So I'm not sure that the transfer from pharmaceutical sector, which I think I completely understand the concern, which is it's like a potential competition concern, but you can see it a lot earlier in the system. I don't think it transfers that happily over to digital markets, particularly because just the nature of the innovation process that's going on.
Just to highlight that there are even yet other arguments in digital markets. So, for example, one argument is that by buying a small player, then you deny your competitors that small player. So actually some of the acquisitions are probably about competition between the big platforms, but directed at trying to tip particular services in one direction or another. So for example, I don't know enough about the Waze acquisition, and I wasn't it was allowed by the CMA and I wasn't involved in that at all, but one could suggest that by buying Waze, Google essentially tipped the maps market very much towards Google and very much away from Apple, where they were more neck and neck before. So that is a market where now, I think, Apple is a bit part player where it was potentially very strong.
Okay, again, feel free to, if you want to jump in further. I think that's a very important discussion, and in particular because all of you mentioned theories of harm and potential problems to competition. So, generally speaking, what I was wondering is when you were highlighting cases, Amelia and Mike as well, you were highlighting cases especially on Google. For example, the double-click acquisition or cases with the European Commission. But as I'm sure you all know today, and I think it was yesterday, Apple was releasing a new software which is basically making it more difficult for Facebook and other similar apps to sort of track users. And there were a lot of harsh words exchanged by those companies on whether this is a good move or this is an anti-competitive monopolistic ploy by Apple. So again, this is probably a very controversial topic, but if you had to basically make a case against Apple, an antitrust lawsuit, which is not just the App Store, do you think it's possible, or do you think we need to focus on other things maybe around Apple now? Sorry, it's the same for everyone. Maybe Amelia, if you want to start. Yeah.
Well, I think it's too specific an example to actually, for anyone involved in a competition authority to be getting into. But what I would highlight is it's an example of the potential tension between privacy concerns and competition concerns. And, for in a lot of ways, privacy and competition sit hand in hand, and there isn't a tension. But this is an example where there potentially is. Likewise, the CMA looked at Google's behavior in the digital ad tech chain, where one of the things that was preventing third party, for example, ad performance verification, was access to data. But the data, Google was concerned about sharing the data for GDPR reasons, post GDPR, and that there was data protection risk. So that's another example where there's this tension. So I think, Mike mentioned this tension earlier. It is a really, really important area, and it's one of the reasons why actually the CMA and the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, are working really, really closely to just make sure these two policy areas work together so far as is conceivably possible.
I don't have anything to add to what Amelia said. I agree with her.
Likewise, it is all quite controversial. It highlights the tensions between competition policy and privacy. And I guess the only thing to add is, whether firms who are trying to engage in anti-competitive behavior will think about trying to cloak that under a privacy lens. That sounds like it's a possibility. Whether it's actually happening, who knows? And that will depend a little bit on how coordinated the regulators are and how strong the ICO is in its enforcement. Because if you could be between a rock and a hard place as a firm, which is, on the one hand, if you shut down access to data for people who depend on that data, you might run into an antitrust problem. But if you don't shut down access to data, then you might run into an ICO problem, both of which could lead you to very swinging fines. And that seems like that seems like something that the regulators need to sort out as to what the appropriate policy balance is there. And on what basis, because I think it's extremely difficult for firms to really know how to behave.
I'd just add that it's sometimes hard to think of Brexit dividends in our area or generally, but this is a potential area of Brexit dividend in that the CMA and the ICO have got a good relationship, and they are the responsible parties for this issue in the UK now. Whereas actually at EU level, data protection is done by national authorities in a potentially holistic, but I think in practice not very not as holistic as you might hope way, whereas competition and regulation will be done centrally. And whether the various parties are able to coordinate as well as we can within the UK, I mean, I really hope that they can, but we have yet to see.
Great. I think just one last question before we move on to the questions from the audience, and again in the same vein of this discussion, in terms of the the overlap potentially between trust and privacy. We did have quite a large controversy around an acquisition last year when Google's acquisition of the wearables maker Fitbit was cleared by the European Commission at the time, and there were a lot of controversy whether this should have been blocked or whether we can actually even design proper remedies given the various potential ways that Google can access, for example, user data and the potential harms to competition. So I think maybe a question again to everyone, but maybe Mike, because of potential differences between the European and the UK approach in terms of privacy or data in competition. Do you think that the CMA definitely has a better approach or a better possibility to address these novel issues?
Well, do we have a better approach? I mean, look, I certainly think that the extent to which we are already cooperating with the Information Commissioner's Office, so the UK privacy regulator, and with Ofcom, so the content regulator, gives us the best chance of getting to the right place on this inherent tension, which, I mean, as David mentioned, you can imagine firms being stuck between a rock and a hard place. So I think we are giving ourselves the best opportunity to come to the best possible place, because clearly you can imagine a world in which a concern about privacy, and that might allow firms to might make it harder for other firms to compete, because their firms can use privacy as a reason to keep data private, even if actually there may not be any good reason for doing so. But equally, you can imagine a world in which just saying it's all about competition can lead to a race to the bottom in terms of privacy and in terms of data being properly curated. And of course, we've seen examples of data not being properly curated. So, all I can say is I agree absolutely with what David said about the issues and the tension, and absolutely regulators in there have got to be talking to each other, which we are doing in the UK.
The only thing I would add is that the very first obligation within the EU set of obligations under the Digital Markets Act is an obligation that requires platforms, the regulated platforms, to gain consent for sharing data across their services. So if you think about Google Fitbit, it should at least, now that merge is going through, provide some additional protection for consumers in that they should be asked absolutely explicitly, do you mind your health data from Fitbit being shared with the rest of Google?
I'll just raise a couple of points on Google Fitbit, not privacy and data sharing points, but more generally about the approach taken. So it's quite interesting from a kind of student of competition policy evolution over the last 20 years, because the concern that was largely raised, particularly in the phase 1 decision, and I don't think the final decision is out yet, is essentially what we used to know as an efficiency offense. So the concern was Google will put the Fitbit data together with its own data and produce a better product, and in some somewhat undefined way, and that will be a competition concern because other people won't be able to put that data together. And they will be at a competitive disadvantage. And many years ago, there was a case which Amelia and I know well called G. Honeywell. Mike may have been involved as well, actually, after which raised an efficiency offence concern, after which the DG Competition Commissioner at the time said, no, there is no such thing as an efficiency offence in EU merger control. That seems to have changed to me. So, and I think there's quite a lot of flavour. I see efficiency offence type arguments being raised in the digital context a lot, not just by the EU, but by other regulators close to home as well, with no particular concern that these are efficiency offence arguments and that is somehow potentially problematic. So I think for me, the sort of merger landscape seems to be shifting, but not in a very acknowledged way, and that might be right, but that I see as that's one thing. And then the second thing is, interestingly, Chief Executive of CMA came out and said we would not have accepted the Fitbit remedy, which was essentially an access remedy. And that to me seems quite a stark statement, because there are going to be, well, potentially there may be some situations in which the proportionate approach is somewhere between block and accept, is to have some kind of access remedy, which is essentially what Google Fitbit remedy was proposing. So that seems to be a bit of a, again, a sort of, we're talking about a Brexit divergence, that both of those areas potentially seem to be areas of potential divergence.
Okay, can I come in and respond to the efficiency offence comments of David? Because I mean, he's absolutely right. We all talked about efficiency offences 20 years ago, and we all poo-pooed them. We said they'd be ridiculous. Although I don't think we ever said that the underlying logic was bad logic. The idea that you could have a merger that led one firm to be so efficient that it was able to drive other firms out of the market, and if there were barriers to re-entry, that would then allow the merged entity to raise prices. I mean, that's all, you know, pretty 101. The question, we all very dubious about the evidence in the past. So David's now suggesting the efficiency offence is coming back and that we're not acknowledging it. Look, I half agree with him. I think the efficiency offence in those stark terms, in some sense, is coming back, but I think we are acknowledging it. I think we are explicitly accepting that, particularly within development strategies, that there may be benefits to these development strategies for consumers in the short run, but that doesn't mean we should also care about the long run harm if those development strategies make it harder for other firms to come in and compete against the incumbents. If you look at the Lear study that the CMA commissioned, looking at various acquisitions by Google, Amazon and Facebook, Lear study 2 or 3 years ago, that study talks about the fact that a lot of the acquisitions, of nearly 300 acquisitions those three companies had done over a 10-year period, were of complementary products, where we would expect there to be some efficiencies. But it also said that's not an end of the debate question. Just because you bought a complementary asset doesn't mean, oh, therefore it's absolutely fine. Same way in vertical mergers, we don't say, yeah, if complementary assets stop. You know, it's still possible to have theories of harm. I do agree they are hard to evidence. I do agree they have to be dealt with care, you know, but I don't think that they can be just ruled out as not being reasonable concerns. So I think David's right that it's coming back. I also think that's right that it is coming back. That's a good thing, Amelia.
And I agree with that, but I also would highlight the first slide I put up, which was the reasons why the Furman Review thought the regulation was needed. Essentially, the first 4 bullets, which I described as inherently economic factors, at least 3 of them are really about efficiencies. So they're about efficiencies driving these markets towards being highly concentrated. But then once they're highly concentrated, clearly over the longer term, that harms innovation, it harms contestability, and it will tend in the end to harm consumers as well. So I think these interactions between efficiencies and the long-term efficiency, as it were, the short-term efficiencies versus long-term efficiencies, you could maybe frame it as, are really important.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point to make, and maybe it's a good time to just focus on a couple of the questions from the audience. One question that comes up from Claudia is in terms of the differences between the UK's and the EU's approach towards the digital platforms. So when we talk about the Digital Markets Unit as opposed to the Digital Markets Act. Maybe we can start with you, David. You did talk about the danger of, the regulatory discrepancy. So what do you think? Which approach probably is the preferable, and how could you amend something that you don't like?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think if you could do it perfectly, then the UK approach would be preferable because it is tailored to specific circumstances. I doubt that it can be done perfectly, and I think there's real scope for it to be done quite badly and with serious adverse consequences. So I think I mentioned there's a sort of sequential element that you could end up regulating part of a market, but not the whole part of that, not all of the people in that market. And that would put it in a quite different place to, for example, say telecoms regulation. When that was set up, there was a very clear understanding of all the different markets in the telecoms sector, and telecoms markets work in a particular way, and there are wholesale bits and there are retail bits and so on, and we knew who was in which bits of that market, and the regulation was applied to people who had dominant positions in the relevant markets. Market definition at the CMA doesn't really happen anymore, and so I think there's a danger of regulating parts of markets, which could lead to very substantial distortions in competition if there isn't great care. So I think I would say quite a bit more care needs to be, in principle, the UK approach would be better, but I think a lot of care needs to be taken in really understanding what's going on, and thinking about all the interactions and how those work, so that the regulation doesn't make things worse, because I think it could in principle go in either direction.
I would just say that I mean, it's clear that there are significant differences between the UK approach and the EU approach. On the other hand, one of the significant differences that people always highlight is that the UK will be bespoke and the EU is just these flat, one-size-fits-all obligations. But actually, when you look at them, they aren't quite as one-size-fits-all as you might think. So actually around half of, in fact, probably slightly more than half of the obligations only apply to one or two core platform services, so particular activities. So that means immediately, they're not across all of the behaviours of all platforms. They're very specific to particular activities. What that has a plus of is it creates a more level playing field, and I guess there is a slight risk with the bespoke approach that it isn't quite as it could, unless the CMA is very, very careful, not create a level playing field. So that's one point about the CPS specific, core platform service specific obligations. Another is this specification process, whereby actually the idea is that there will be the idea actually under both regimes really is that there will be a lot of participation and discussion between the platforms and the regulator to try and get to broadly the right position where the unintended consequences, which David was referring to and are absolutely understood, are limited to the greatest extent. It is true the UK is more explicit about the avoiding of unintended consequences than the EU, but I think the specification process and the general principle of proportionality in EU law means that broadly the same will be true. So there's going to be, for the vast majority of the obligations, there's going to be the specification process and discussion. So I think that hopefully will make it not quite as different as they look, and also the EU slightly less one size fits all.
I mean, I'm obviously shocked that David thinks that we won't do a perfect job with the DMU. But if I can get over that, look, I mean, I actually don't think there is a huge amount of difference in reality between these two sets of proposals. I mean, there's differences in detail, but they're proposals. Their aim is the same thing, to deal with the exercise existing market power and to open up markets for future competition. We are going to iterate to solutions on both sides of the channel. I would be really surprised if we end up with approaches that lead to significantly different outcomes.
Thank you. I think that's probably a very interesting discussion as well to continue. Unfortunately, just for the interest of time, I will ask one more question from the audience from you, especially around when it comes to, for example, trying to understand new business models, but trying to also regulate them whilst not doing more harm, as many, including David, mentioned. What do you think are the implications for competition of machine learning, AI and big data? I'm focusing in particular on the economic side rather than policy? Do you think we understand its implications, for example, with recommendation algorithms, or it's still very early? Amelia, maybe if you want to start, I think you did some very interesting look into Spotify.
So I mean, I think that broadly the algorithms are doing good things in that they are helping these firms to predict better what their users want, essentially, and offering. So the streaming platforms are offering playlists that give listeners music that, you know, they're pretty likely to like, and that's being done by algorithms. I think but there are a whole set of issues then around these algorithms. One is whether there is sufficient access to data for everybody that could be coming up with great playlists. Is the data in the hands of the most innovative players for coming up with these new products for consumers, or is it very proprietarily held? Are there real economies of scale in it? So actually what you end up is just one player having all of the data and being able to provide the best product. This is the efficiency offense in a way, and no one else can compete because they can't get anywhere near the levels of data. And actually there's a really interesting example there that the CMA looked at in terms of search, where both Bing and Google provide search engines, and they're both, you know, they're both big in user numbers, but Google has about 95% market share and Bing has about 5% market share. What that means is that Google has a lot more data, in particular on the tail queries, the things that we don't ask very often. And what that means is that Google's search service is basically better than Bing's, but because people are using it more, and there's this kind of virtuous circle. This wouldn't necessarily matter if there were lots of players out there and, you know, with similar data, but it does matter when markets start to tip. And the reason I was concerned about streaming platforms is that increasingly that is becoming the sole way for music to get to listeners. It used to be you'd have radio and you'd try and get onto radio, and it didn't really matter if their playlists weren't perfect because you had other ways to get to there were lots and lots of radio stations, and there were other ways to get to listeners. Increasingly, there are going to be just a very few routes to get to listeners, and that's also the way in which you make money from your music. So in that circumstance, you have to make sure that that's a level playing field, that it's very fair, that it is as open to competition as possible, both on the platform level, but also in terms of the music on the platform. And I was also worried, we were also worried in our paper about algorithms being very, very clever, but not quite as clever as they thought they were, and having unintended side effects. So for example, one of the unintended side effects might be that they don't give enough regard to music in non-English language. So they might so if algorithms start to prioritize English language music over non-English language music, then we actually have cultural issues potentially, as well as competition issues. So there are a number of the issues we raised in our paper.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely probably a very good note on which to, unfortunately, we need to end our discussion as our time has come to an end. Even though I'm sure we can discuss this much longer. So again, thank you for all the panelists, Amelia, Mike, and David, and also thank you everyone who posted questions or came to participate virtually. Please don't forget to sign up to our mailing list. We will have interesting events in the future as well, and you can also find the recordings of all of our events on our YouTube channel, including for this event as well. A massive thank you for the Myland Institute, in particular Patrick, Sophia, and Paul, who helped to organize this event. And again, thank you for coming today, and hope we can see you soon again.